You're watching Noir Street. I'm your host, Nero Wolfe. Every story hides a secret, and every shadow hides a clue. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. Subscribe, tap the like button, and join us as we drift into mystery. That improves the code books. Also, the lawyer. Yes. He knew what it was. Yes. And feared its reading more than its theft. Yes. Wolfe nodded once. Then tomorrow you will begin with him. Men who live by paper often die by it too, but usually not before they have lied about its importance. He was right, as he generally is in retrospect and annoyingly often in advance. The next afternoon, I went to Graham Vale's office on Madison, where old money goes to be translated into clauses, and found the receptionist already worried enough to be useful. That is another thing about lawyers. If their clerks look frightened before you speak, someone has been overworking the truth. Mr. Vale, she told me, was not in conference. He was unavailable. He had gone out unexpectedly after luncheon. He had not returned. I gave her my name and the Wolfe connection and enough of my expression to suggest that delay might become expensive for furniture, that produced a file copy of his movements by way of nervous obedience. He had left the office at 3:30, gone to the Ashford house, and telephoned once from there at 4:10. After that, nothing. So I went to the Ashford house again. By then the auction rooms had been stripped of their respectable greed and reduced to afterthought, chairs stacked, catalogues abandoned, servants carrying silver and resentment in separate trays. The sorting room was sealed by police order, but the library beyond it was open, and in the library Graham Vale was found. He had remained after the crowd was gone. Not alone by choice, perhaps, but alone enough to die accurately. He was on the carpet by the writing table, not sprawled, just set down wrongly by whatever had ended him. One hand still held a reading lens. The other was near a sheaf of papers scattered in a line too straight for accident. The lamp on the side desk was lit outside. The windows held that blue-grey city half-light which comes before full dark and flatters neither innocence nor mahogany. His head had not been struck. The doctor later said chloral again, with perhaps more than chloral behind it. By the look of the man's mouth and the overturned cordial glass near the desk blotter, I believed him. And the one thing missing was the box no one had wanted. That is not poetry. It is arithmetic. Clara Ashford stood by the mantel when I entered, very straight and very pale. Gerard Ashford was at the far window, looking as if he would have preferred a lawsuit to a second corpse, but had been denied the choice. Pelham Voss had come back because auctioneers, like undertakers, hate loose inventory. Kramer was there too, because New York has only one reliable response to multiplying dead men, and that is to become louder about procedure, he said. He stayed behind. Clara nodded. He asked for time alone with the property papers. He said he needed to review what ought properly to be turned over and what might involve protected family matters. Inspector Kramer allowed him supervised use in the library. She glanced toward Kramer with no gratitude. Then there was another 10 minutes of confusion because my cousin decided to object to his own relatives in 3 directions at once. When we came back, Graham was dead. And the box, gone, Kramer barked. The damned box is gone. That was true, and more than that. Somewhere between reading and understanding, Graham Vale had sealed his own fate. I looked at the desk. Several documents remained, enough to show he had been sorting, trust references, property schedules, one folded memorandum in his hand, or near enough to count, but the calf-bound ledger booklet, the one with the bent clasp, was absent, along with the box itself. "Who saw it last?" I asked. Kramer said. "Vale did. That's tidy." "It's murder," he snapped. "Tidy comes later." Stebbins, who had been searching the shelves with the patience of a monk and the soul of a stenographer, looked up. Glass smells bitter again. That made 2. Marcus Pell dead by blow in the scramble over the box. Graham Vale dead after time alone with its contents. The object that had drawn no bids and no public curiosity had turned out to be exactly what rooms of rich people fear most: paper that remembers. I crossed to the writing table and looked at the memorandum under Vale's hand. It was one page from modern stationery, not old, and the words on it had been written recently enough that the ink still carried a slight shine in the desk light. Only one sentence. If these are read aloud, the North title collapses. No signature, no salutation, no courtesy, just panic in business dress. I showed it to Kramer. He swore once, properly. Then he said, "Wolf gets this tonight." "Yes," I said. I already knew that. On the way back downtown, I thought about the room at the auction and the way everybody had avoided lot 47 like a contagious relic. They had known enough to fear it before any of us saw what was inside. Graham Vale had known more. He had remained after the crowd had gone, sorting what others ignored, trying perhaps to separate danger from inheritance by the old legal method of paper into paper. But some truths don't thin that way. By the time I reached the brownstone, Wolf was in the office with the lamp low and beer ready, and Fritz offended by the lateness of civilization generally. I told him all of it. Marcus Pell dead first. In the corridor scramble, the box opened. Old collateral holding papers, Graham Vale anxious, returning to review them privately. Dead before night fully settled. Bitter glass, missing box, missing ledger, memorandum. If these are read aloud, the North title collapses. When I finished, Wolf shut his eyes. "At last," he said, "it behaves properly. That's a strange thing to say about 2 murders. Number about motive. The first death was over possession. The second was over comprehension. Marcus Pell died because the box became reachable at the wrong moment. Graham Vale died because he stayed behind long enough to confirm what he had long feared the papers would prove. That's cheerful. It is exact." He opened his eyes. Archie, the room at the auction, avoided the lot because enough of them knew its danger, but not enough of them knew its contents. Graham Vale knew both. Therefore he became urgent to someone. "Tomorrow you will learn what the North title is, why its collapse matters, and who in that room had reason to fear reading aloud more than murder." That sent me upstairs later with the city wet below my window and the whole thing moving into shape. At the Ashford auction, wealth had changed hands with practiced ease. One little box had drawn no bids and no curiosity, because the people present had agreed that curiosity was unsafe. Marcus Pell died because the box could still be seized. Graham Vale died because he stayed behind with the contents and discovered how much more than property they threatened. And the one item missing, after all that cultivated avoidance, was the box no one had wanted. Chapter 3. The value of being ignored. There are objects that command a room and objects that disappear in one. The first kind are often expensive and almost always overrated. The second kind are more useful, especially if someone has spent time teaching a group of people not to see them. Lot 47 had been taught the trick. By the morning after Graham Vale died in the Ashford Library, the little wooden box had acquired a weight out of all proportion to its size. It was still missing. So was the calf, bound ledger that had been inside it. Marcus Pell was dead because the box had become suddenly worth snatching. Graham Vale was dead because he had remained behind to sort what it meant. And every respectable scavenger who had sat through the auction the day before was now pretending the lot had been worthless, obscure, laughable, beneath notice, and possibly beneath existence. When too many people call the same thing insignificant, Wolf says, "Archie, significance has already entered the room and removed its hat." That was at breakfast. Fritz had produced kidneys, eggs, toast, and coffee of a quality that improved my temper enough to endure philosophy and Wolf. Having heard my full report the night before, had settled into the case with the expression he reserves for human greed when it finally presents itself in organized form. "You will return to the estate," he said. "You will speak to every bidder, dealer, hanger, on, and ornamental heir who was present when Lot 47 was passed. I was hoping for a day in court or prison. Those may come. Begin with the room. Why was the box ignored?" "It wasn't," I said. "It was only treated that way." He opened one eye. "Good. That is the chapter title for your thoughts. Find out whether the silence was individual caution or collective arrangement. There is a distinction. There usually is. People just hate paying for it. He shut the eye again. Also, the missing box grows heavier by the hour because no one has yet told us whether it threatened title, reputation, blackmail, or all three. Learn what the bidders feared. By asking, number by listening to what they declined to answer. That sent me east again, properly dressed and increasingly tired of old money, pretending it has no imagination except for upholstery. The Ashford estate had changed overnight from a house in sale to a house under stain. A policeman stood at the front hall with the settled gloom of a man who had been told to guard furniture and hated the assignment. The ballroom was half emptied. Crates stood open, like interrupted arguments. Servants moved more carefully than usual, which is what servants do when the household's private rot has become municipal. I began where Wolfe had told me to begin, not with evidence, but with the room. Auction rooms, like card tables and funerals, remember posture long after they have forgotten sincerity. The chairs from yesterday's sale were still there in reduced number, stacked along one wall. And I stood where I had stood yesterday and looked again at the place Lot 47 had occupied on the table. A small wooden box had been announced. No one had bid. No one had laughed. No one had made the easy little noise of connoisseur contempt. They had all simply let the silence happen. That was not indifference. That was coordination quiet enough to pass for manners. Pelham Voss arrived before I could improve on the thought. He was as smooth as ever, but the smoothness had gone brittle at the edges. Auctioneers dislike dead clients, dead staff, dead lawyers, and missing lots, though not always in that order. Mr. Goodwin, Mr. Voss, you are back again. This is becoming a habit. It's becoming a homicide count. He gave me a thin, practiced sigh. What now? The bidders. That sounds exhausting. It is, which is why I'm sharing it. I asked him for the list of registered buyers and attendees. He hesitated just enough to remind me that auctioneers value discretion, the way priests value collars, then handed it over because Kramer had already bruised his civic pride. And he preferred Wolfe's methods to the police only in retrospect, not in principle. There were 32 names of consequence, 12 of them dealers, 5 family, 3 museum men, 2 lawyers, 1 woman listed only as Miss C. Ashford, and enough collectors to populate an expensive nightmare. I began with the nearest and most plausible, Mr. Osric Fenn, dealer in continental decorative arts and local authority on underpaying widows, with sincerity. I found him in the rear music room studying a pair of ormolu sconces, as if their future depended on his lower lip. He was 60 if he was vain, and 68 if he was honest, with white hair, narrow hands, and the dead bright eyes dealers acquire after 50 years of having no emotional reaction except margin. Mr. Fenn. He turned. Goodwin, isn't it? It still is. Yesterday you bid on silver and bronzes and sat mute through lot 47. He looked pleasantly bored. A wooden box of uncertain contents. Why should I bid? That was my question. I just answered it. Number you described the catalogue. That improved him slightly. Bored men like him enjoy being told their laziness lacks style, Fenn said. Very well. I did not bid because the lot had no visible merit. Then why did you stop looking at it only after the gavel fell? He blinked once. That was more than enough. I often conserve my attention. Not that selectively. His mouth thinned. Mr. Goodwin, if you are suggesting that I knew more about the lot than I admitted, you flatter me. Number, I suspect you knew as much as the rest of the room did. Enough to be careful, and not enough to be comfortable. That earned me a dry little exhale. People in my line become sensitive to atmosphere. Yes, and lot 47 had atmosphere. Because he adjusted the line of one cuff. Because no one else wanted to be first. That was useful, I asked. First to do what? To show interest. And why not? Because showing interest is sometimes a species of announcement. That one went straight into the notebook. Next I took the museum men separately and got the same polished hunger coated in different varnish. One, a Mr. Bromley from the Metropolitan, insisted the lot was beneath institutional notice. The other, a Mr. Kester from a smaller museum uptown, said he had not even marked the number. Both men had the same flaw. They remembered the description too exactly for something beneath notice. I told Bromley so, he said. I read all catalogues thoroughly. Then why did you not bid $10? He smiled with museum sorrow. Because $10 can become expensive if the room wishes it. That was not courage, but it was almost testimony. The dealers improved the pattern instead of changing it. None of them admitted knowledge. All of them admitted hesitation without using the word. One said the lot had family heats around it. Another called it tainted, domestic. A third, after 2 lies and 1 sigh, said, in New York certain objects belong to ownership disputes before they belong to history. Smart people let them settle. There it was again, not lack of interest, but trained avoidance. By noon I had enough versions of the same evasion to begin hearing the choir. Every bidder claimed the lot had been worthless, beneath notice, obscure, doubtful. But their eyes yesterday had all gone to it, and then away from it in the same rhythm. That takes either contagion or rehearsal. I tried Clara Ashford next, because family members, unlike dealers, lie from wounds instead of profession, and the sound differs if you listen correctly. She received me in the blue morning room with coffee untouched, and a stack of condolence cards that had not yet earned the dignity of opening. You're interviewing the cowards, she said. Yes, how useful. Moderately. Yesterday everyone ignored lot 47 too neatly. That was not ignorance. She took a cigarette from a silver box, looked at it, and put it back. There are family objects people do not bid on because to bid is to choose sides. The box was one of them. Why? Because it had belonged to my grandfather's study and then vanished for 20 years into what my aunt called schoolroom storage, which was her term for any object likely to embarrass the next generation. Did you know what was in it? Did Gerard. I think he feared he might. That helped. Gerard Ashford himself helped less, but he was too angry by then to be dull. I found him in the billiard room abusing a decanter for an offense no one else had committed. You again, he said. I thought the room deserved repetition. He gave me a murderous glance and did not improve his chances by it. You did not bid on lot 47, I said. Number. Why not? Because old boxes full of paper are for lawyers and scavengers. That's awkward since the lawyer who stayed behind with it is dead. His grip tightened on the glass. Are you accusing me? I'm accusing the room. You were part of it. He laughed once without humor. Every one in that room knew enough not to touch Ashford private archives in public. There, that's better. Why not? He looked at me and realized, a second too late, that he had said more than he meant to. Because, he snapped, if the thing contained what some people thought it might contain, then the first person to bid would have announced himself either a fool or a claimant. Claimant to what? He stopped. I waited. He hated both things and therefore gave me the truth in the smallest possible shape. 2 old property questions. Another polite word. They were growing like weeds. I took that back to Voss and asked whether anyone had spoken to him about the lot before the sale. He hesitated, looked at the open ballroom, and then admitted that Graham Vale had asked the day before whether the lot might be withdrawn, not bought withdrawn. Did he say why? Voss's face thinned. He said there were title irregularities touching private family papers, and he preferred not to have the matter exposed to the vulgarity of bidding. That sounds like Graham Vale. Yes, I declined. Once catalogued, I do not indulge private nerves unless I'm paid more than the estate had yet managed. That improved Voss a little. By then the missing box had grown heavier in meaning by the hour, just as Wolfe predicted. Marcus Pell dead over possession. Graham Vale dead over comprehension. A whole room of experts agreeing to value it publicly at nothing, because privately it might contain enough poison to collapse somebody's certainty of title. The absence of interest had become what it truly was. Quiet coordination, or at least quiet obedience to the same fear. I telephoned Wolfe from the Ashford Library at 1:30 and gave him the broad shape. He said, "Good. The room was instructed by history." That's one phrase. Number it is the correct one, continue. Who first spread the understanding that the lot must not be touched. That I don't yet have. Then get it. Rooms do not coordinate themselves. Someone in them is always the conductor. That sent me back over the list with less patience and more appetite. By 3 o'clock, I had the beginning of it. Graham Vale had not merely asked Voss to withdraw the lot. He had spoken separately, quietly, to 2 dealers and 1 museum man before the sale. Clara Ashford had seen him do it. The dealers admitted only that Vale had advised caution. That was lawyer language translated into auction fear. So the room had not invented its own silence. It had been nudged into it by Graham Vale, who then stayed behind to read the very papers he had tried to keep out of open bidding and died for learning too much of what they contained. When I got back to West 35th, Wolf heard me through, and then did what he sometimes does when a pattern has at last become decent enough to name. He leaned back, shut his eyes, and looked almost comfortable. The value of being ignored, he said. That was my thought. Yes, but now it is less sloppy. Lot 47 was dangerous not because anyone knew precisely what it held, but because enough of them knew approximately what it threatened. Graham Vale ceded caution in the room. The bidders obeyed because in such circles, ignorance is often the cheapest form of loyalty. Then he himself remained behind to sort the contents, and someone killed him before caution could become disclosure. I sat down. The missing box is now the heaviest object in New York. Number only in your case. New York has heavier ones, but it is sufficiently heavy. He opened one eye. Tomorrow you will discover the North properties and why their title might collapse if those papers were read aloud. Chapter 1. The lot that passed in silence. There are public silences and private ones. And if you spend enough time with Nero Wolfe, you learn to distrust both. A public silence is when a room full of people all fail to notice the same thing at the same time. A private silence is what Wolfe produces when he already knows I am wrong and is waiting to see whether I will improve before he has to spend words on me. The one at the Ashford Estate auction was public, and it had money in it. It began at 2:30 on a Thursday, in the ballroom of the old Ashford house on East 68th Street, with a long line of chairs, a polished platform, 6 palms, trying to look tropical in November, and enough old silver porcelain, lacquer, and gilt under one roof to keep 3 generations of appraisers in motor cars. I was there because Wolfe had sent me, which is how I come to spend so much of my time in places I would not enter voluntarily unless there were sandwiches. The caller that morning had been Mrs. Eveline Fenwick, widow, collector, and client of Wolfe's by preference, rather than habit. She owned too many miniatures and too little peace, and for once her agitation had not been over theft, but over anticipation. "Mr. Wolfe," she had said on the telephone, in the tone of a woman who had never in her life accepted delay as a condition of existence. "There is a sale this afternoon at the Ashford estate. One item, lot 47, is listed so obscurely that it is either worthless or important, and I dislike both possibilities." Wolfe, who dislikes auction rooms because they require standing or bidding or both, had said, "Then do not attend." I am not asking for social advice. I want Mr. Goodwin there. That had sent me east in a dark suit and a fair mood, with written instructions from Wolfe that included no more than, observe, do not bid unless compelled. If compelled, bid reluctantly. So there I was, at the back of the ballroom, leaning against a doorframe and looking over a room that had been arranged to make greed appear cultivated. There were dealers with resigned faces and alert fingers, widows with lorgnettes and opinions, 2 museum men pretending not to compete, 1 red-haired woman in black who looked as if she had come either to buy something or forgive nothing, and enough lawyers on the edges to prove that someone had died expensively. The Ashford house itself was one of those old New York mansions built when people still believed stone could make breeding hereditary. High ceilings, music room beyond, carved mantels, gold frames, and carpet thick enough to muffle a confession. The family had lasted 3 generations longer than taste, and 1 generation less than money, which is often the proper proportion. The auctioneer was a long, smooth man named Pelham Voss, who handled a gavel the way a violinist handles a bow, not because the task required art, but because his vanity did. He had a narrow brown face, silver hair, and a voice that could make a cracked teacup sound ancestral. The sale had begun briskly and dishonestly, as all good auctions do. A Louis XIV commode went for less than it should have, and more than the buyer deserved. A pair of Chinese jars caused a small war among two ladies, dressed alike enough to suggest conspiracy. A landscape attributed to someone dead enough to be profitable went to a man in the second row with a carnation and a nervous jaw. A set of Georgian silver made the room remember manners long enough to become savage over price. I was not there for commodes, jars, landscapes, or silver. I was there for lot 47. When it came without fanfare. That was the first thing wrong with it. Voss glanced at his clerk, lifted one slip of paper, and said, "Lot 47, a small carved wooden casket from the schoolroom cabinet, provenance uncertain, late 19th century, contents not guaranteed, sold as found." That should have produced one of two things, contempt or curiosity. In a room full of dealers and collectors, an obscure box with uncertain contents is either a piece of firewood or a rumor with hinges. It should not have produced nothing. But it did. The clerk set it on the table. It was about 14 inches long, dark wood, plain except for a border of worn carving around the lid. No brass monogram, no obvious lock, no decorative flourish to seduce fools. A modest thing, and perhaps because it was modest the room pretended not to see it. Voss said, "Shall we begin at $20? Nothing. That by itself was peculiar, but not enough to write home to Wolfe. Rooms go stale. People save their paddle hands for larger vanities." Voss smiled with auctioneer patience. 10. Then. Nothing. He looked left, right, and toward the rear where I was, but nobody in the room moved. More than that, they did not shift, whisper, or frown. The stillness had shape. The room was not ignoring the box from indifference. It was avoiding it by agreement. A man near the center, who had bid like a pirate on a silver tea service, now found the grain in the floor fascinating. One of the museum men lifted his catalogue and turned a page he had already turned. The red-haired woman in black lit a cigarette in a room where smoking had been discouraged twice. An elderly dealer who had spent the last hour whispering numbers into his own cuff stayed motionless enough to suggest prayer. Voss let the silence sit one beat too long. That told me he felt it too. "No interest," he said lightly. "A charming object." That was not a sales phrase. That was a probe. Still nothing. He dropped the lot with a tap of the gavel sharp enough to sound annoyed. Passed. And just like that, the room resumed breathing. The next lot, a set of framed sporting prints not fit to line a kennel, drew 3 bids in as many seconds. That was when I stopped pretending I was merely there to do Mrs. Fenwick a favor. I took out the catalogue and checked the line. Lot 40. 7 had indeed been listed obscurely, almost invisibly, between a lacquered screen and a tray of snuff boxes. 47. Small carved wooden casket, schoolroom cabinet, provenance uncertain, contents not guaranteed. Not much. Not enough to make a room full of professionals decide simultaneously to discover other uses for their eyes. I moved forward at the interval and got near the side table where the lots awaiting removal were being gathered by a young clerk with a pale face and a limp collar. He had the look of a man who had taken this employment for culture and discovered labor instead. "Lot 47, I said. "Where's it going?" He blinked. "Back to the sorting room, I suppose." "You suppose." "I only carry what Mr. Voss tells me. What do people usually do when a room of experts pretends a box isn't there?" He looked at me quickly and then away. "I wouldn't know, sir." That was too prompt to be useless and too frightened to be innocent. "Good," I said. "Keep not knowing it. But tell me who consigned the lot." He swallowed. "It's all Ashford property." "Which Ashford?" That earned me no answer because a woman's voice behind me said, "The wrong one." I turned. She was the red-haired woman in black, closer now, with grey eyes, a narrow face, and the sort of self-command that suggests practice rather than peace. 35 perhaps, no jewelry, except a small gold pin at the lapel. She held a cigarette between two fingers and did not bother to pretend she had not been listening. "You're Goodwin," she said. "That depends who wants to know." "My name is Clara Ashford." That fit her too well to argue with. There are women whose names sound inherited, and women whose names sound chosen after litigation. Hers was inherited. "The wrong Ashford," I said. She gave the smallest nod toward the ballroom. "My late uncle's things are being sold, but lot 47 should not have been in the room." "Why not?" "Because no one who knows this family would touch it." "That's very nearly a reason to bid." Her mouth moved, but did not become a smile. "It would be if you had no instinct for survival." I looked past her into the room. Voss was bringing down a marble clock and making it sound martial across the rows. An older man with broad shoulders and a banker's forehead was watching me without moving his head. There was enough dislike in the look to count as pre-existing. I said, "Who's the gentleman rehearsing my obituary?" She didn't turn. "My cousin Gerard. He believes property ought to travel in straight lines and women ought not to interfere with them." "That's a large category of men." "Yes." "What's in the box?" "I don't know." "You just told me no one would touch it." "That is not the same thing." "It never is," I said. "You asked for me." Number Mrs. Fenwick did that on her own, which was the first useful thing she has done in years. Clara Ashford let ash fall delicately into a porcelain saucer that did not deserve it. "But since you are here, stay until the end. Someone will try for the box once the room thins." That interested me more than if she had burst into tears. That means somebody needs it too much to let chance take it. She moved away before I could improve on that, which was skillful of her and discourteous of fortune. I stayed. By 5:30 the ballroom had thinned into the hard core, dealers waiting for bargains, relatives waiting for disappointment, and the auction house people waiting for fees. Lot 47 did not reappear. I made myself visible to the side door, the sorting table, and the passage leading to the back rooms, which required standing still long enough to become furniture and bored enough to pass for it. At 6:10 I saw the pale clerk from earlier come through the side passage, carrying 3 unsold lots against his chest, and on top of them was the box. He was heading not toward storage, but toward the rear corridor. I pushed off the wall and intercepted him in the passage just beyond the ballroom doors. "Going somewhere?" His face emptied. "Back room, sir, with all 3. "Yes, sir." "Why does your left hand shake only when you lie?" He nearly dropped the box. Before I could improve on the moment, a man behind me said, "Stand aside, Goodwin." I turned. It was Gerard Ashford, the cousin Clara had named, up close now and less decorative than at a distance, mid-40s, broad, smooth, shaved, fine coat, expensive irritation. He had the sort of mouth that had learned restraint socially and never privately. "That box is family property," he said. "Everything here is family property until the money finishes it. It has been withdrawn. That must have happened in the last 30 seconds. He took a step nearer. "You are here on behalf of that old woman, Fenwick or Wolfe, or whoever has hired you. This matter does not concern outsiders." That was a little too polished to be spontaneous, I said. "Then why is your clerk trying to sneak it out through the back?" "He is not my clerk." "Number. But you said withdrawn as if paperwork followed your wishes with a bell." The pale clerk made a small desperate noise and tried to sidle off. I put a hand on the top lot and held the stack where it was. From the rear room came another voice, calm and male and carrying authority, as though it had grown there naturally. "Mr. Ashford, if you are going to lie, do it farther from my inventory." Pelham Voss stepped into the corridor, with his gavel still in hand, which improved the scene by making it look as if judgment had come in evening wear. He looked at the clerk, at me, at Gerard Ashford, and finally at the box. "Ah," he said. "There we are," Gerard Ashford said. "This is an internal family matter." Voss's brows rose delicately. "Not once it has touched my platform." Clara Ashford appeared at the other end of the passage as if she had been expected by the architecture. Now it is a public one. That gave us a nice little arrangement. Cousin, auctioneer, clerk, box, and me in the middle, wishing Wolf liked hallways better. I said, "Fine, someone tell me why a room full of rich scavengers refused to bid on a wooden box worth maybe $15 in material and enough in terror to improve everybody's posture." No one answered. That was when the lights in the rear corridor went out, not all the house lights, just the rear passage and sorting room, neatly and exactly, leaving the ballroom glow behind us and throwing the corridor into a dim half. Dark where shapes had edges but motives could move. The clerk yelped. The stack shifted. My hand tightened on the top lot. Gerard Ashford swore. Clara said, sharply, "Don't let him take it." Then something hard glanced off my shoulder. Somebody collided with the clerk. Wood hit the floor, and by the time the lights came back 3 seconds later, the box was gone. The clerk was on one knee, white as boiled linen. Gerard Ashford had one sleeve torn at the cuff, and a fury on his face fit to heat. A conservatory. Clara Ashford stood motionless, except for the cigarette now broken in her fingers. Pelham Voss still had the gavel in his hand, and looked as if he might use it on commerce. Generally, I looked down. The other 2 unsold lots were on the floor. Lot 47 was not. Voss said, very quietly, "No one leaves." Gerard Ashford rounded on him. "Don't be ridiculous." Voss lifted the gavel. "Mr. Ashford, in my house I decide when ridicule has been exhausted." I was about to suggest we call Kramer and improve everyone's evening when a woman screamed from the sorting room. It was not an ornamental scream, not the kind used in drawing rooms to indicate nerves. It was workmanlike and direct, the sort that means the trouble has become visible. We went in at once. The sorting room was long, bright, lined with trestle tables and half-packed objects waiting for transport. At the far end, near an open packing crate, a man lay on his back with his head at the wrong angle and his hands empty. Pelham Voss said one word. "Marcus." The pale clerk behind me said, "Oh God." I crossed the room because dead men improve nothing by waiting. He was about 50, narrow-faced, in shirt-sleeves, with a shipping label still stuck to one cuff, and a bruise spreading dark at the temple. I had seen him earlier, making notes over the unsold lots. Warehouse foreman, or floor manager, not breathing now. Beside the crate was a splintered bronze paperweight in the shape of a hound, and under the packing table, just visible in the shadow beyond, was the corner of a small carved wooden box. Lot 47 had turned from silence into motive, exactly on schedule. I straightened and looked around at the faces in the room. Clara Ashford pale and hard. Gerard Ashford furious and too controlled. Voss furious and not controlled at all. The clerk shaking, the servants frozen in their functions, and knew one thing already. Whatever was in that box had been powerful enough to keep a ballroom quiet. By evening it was powerful enough to kill for. Chapter 2. The lawyer who stayed behind. If you want to improve a bad evening, do not add a corpse and a family lawyer. One will make the police methodical, and the other will make everyone else dishonest in complete sentences. Marcus Pell, the auction room foreman, had been dead less than 5 minutes when Inspector Kramer arrived with Sergeant Stebbins and enough official disapproval to make the Ashford ballroom feel underdressed. I had telephoned Wolf from the front hall, while Pelham Voss was still trying to keep heirs, dealers, servants, and panic in separate corners. What happened? Wolf had asked. An unsold lot developed social value. There was a scramble, a blackout, and now one of Voss's men is dead on the sorting room floor. The box that started it is still here for the moment. For the moment, Wolf repeated. That's the part I don't trust. Good, trust nothing, especially heirs. That is Wolf at his warmest. By the time Kramer had finished disliking my presence, disliking the dead man, disliking the family, and disliking the auctioneer for having both a corpse and opinions under one roof. The box had been retrieved from beneath the packing table and placed on a cleared surface under Stebbins's eye. It was still closed. Whatever had made a room avoid it, and a man die within 10 feet of it, remained inside. Kramer said, "Open it." Pelham Voss said, "In the presence of witnesses." Clara Ashford said, "And of counsel." Gerard Ashford said, "This is nonsense. It belongs to the estate." I said, "If you people line up any straighter, someone will begin taking attendance." That got me exactly nowhere, which was about average. Counsel arrived 10 minutes later in the person of Graham Vale, family solicitor, long-time legal steward to the Ashfords, and the sort of man who looked as if he had been pressed not merely in clothing, but in principle. He was thin, elegant, almost dry enough to rustle, with silver at the temples and a dark, precise mouth that had learned never to waste a word where implication would do cheaper work. He came in, carrying gloves and a briefcase, and stopped only once, at the sight of Marcus Pell on the floor, under a sheet. "Well," he said, "that complicates things. If I had been Clara Ashford, I might have slapped him since I was only Archie Goodwin. I settled for disliking him at once." The box was opened in the sorting room under Kramer's eye, Stebbins's pencil, Voss's outrage, and the family's accumulated nerves. It held no jewels, no old letters tied in blue ribbon, no miniature on ivory, no pistol, no private diary, no priest, whole key, no romantic nonsense at all. It held papers, 3 packets of them, wrapped in old tissue and ribbon gone brittle, deeds, trust amendments, letters, memoranda, and one small ledger booklet with calf binding and a brass clasp bent out of true. The first sheet, in a hand old enough to feel valuable before it was read, bore the title, Private Schedule of Collateral Holdings Relating to the Ashford North Properties, that improved the room by worsening everybody in it. Graham Vale did not move for a second. Then he did something more informative than movement. He became careful. Clara Ashford said, "What is it?" He answered too quickly. "Probably old title abstracts. Nothing to alarm anyone." That was the first lie of his I heard, and like most first lies it was meant less to deceive than to delay. Kramer took one look at the heading and said, "Box it, seal it." Graham Vale inclined his head as if the police had just proposed borrowing an umbrella. "Inspector, those are estate papers. They may involve privileged material and long-standing trust arrangements." Kramer's face thickened. "They may involve murder before I'm done." That shut him up, though not for long. Since Marcus Pell was inconveniently dead, and the family too wealthy to be left unrepresented in the same building as scandal, Kramer ordered the room sealed, the box taken into custody, and everyone substantial enough to sue or lie instructed not to leave town. This delighted no one and improved my evening moderately. I got back to West 35th, after 10 with rain in my collar, and a notebook full of expensive evasions. Wolf was in the office, naturally, in his chair, naturally, and with one eyebrow slightly elevated, which in him is almost a dance. "Well," he said. I gave it to him from the top. Silent room at lot 47. No bids. General avoidance. Rear corridor blackout. Marcus Pell dead by a blow from a bronze hound paperweight. Box recovered. Box opened. Box full of family property papers touching collateral holdings and North properties. Graham Vale, family lawyer, arriving afterward and wishing the contents smaller than they were. Wolf grunted when I reached the heading. "Collateral holdings," he said. "Phew, that phrase alone should warrant imprisonment. Anything else?" "Yes, find out who benefited most from the room, pretending not to care." That was the right question, and by then I knew it. At the Ashford estate auction, everyone had ignored lot 40. 7 just enough, not too much, or it would have looked like fear, not too little, or someone else might have bought it for $10 in candor. Their silence had been a community act of self-protection, arranged by a lawyer who knew the danger and relied on the room's instinct for inherited trouble. The box was still missing, and every hour it stayed missing made it worth a little more to whoever had it and a little less to everybody else's nerves. Chapter 4. The papers without a price. It is one of the minor defects of civilization that paper usually looks innocent. Murder weapons have the decency to appear blunt, edged, loaded, or at least badly tempered. Paper just lies there in stacks and packets and folded sheets, waiting for someone to tell the truth about it. If no one does, it keeps its manners and ruins people quietly. The papers from Lot 47 had no market price worth speaking of. That was what made them dangerous. By 10 the next morning, I was in Kramer's office, looking at the inventory list of what had been inside the box, before the box itself vanished, and before Graham Vale improved the estate by becoming a corpse. The police had not recovered the missing wooden casket or the calf-bound ledger booklet, but Marcus Pell's inventory notes, Voss's sale annotations, and Stebbins's conscientious scavenging had given us enough to know the broad contents: not jewels, not bearer bonds, not negotiable securities, no exotic treaty, no confession in blood, no royal miniature wrapped in lace and scandal. Just old deeds, memoranda, unsigned family letters, survey abstracts, and one ledger index referring to collateral holdings under subsidiary names that had either never existed publicly or had existed only long enough to pass land through them and then die of paperwork. Kramer slapped the list with a forefinger thick enough to bruise stationery. Nothing in here worth killing 2 men over. Yes, I said, accept the whole thing. He scowled. Don't get literary. I'm being factual in a superior style. That improved him exactly not at all. He shoved the list toward me. You and Wolf think title. I think maybe blackmail, old letters, hidden transfers, family dirt. Those are cousins, I told him. In New York they often share lawyers. He grunted and let me take the copies. One advantage of irritating Kramer for years is that eventually he begins sharing useful things out of pure exhaustion. Back at the brownstone, Wolf was in the office, where God and Fritz intended him to remain. The weather had at last remembered spring, and the windows were open a measured inch against the city's diluted racket. From upstairs came the faint green smell of the plant rooms and Wolf's fortune in orchids. On the side table sat beer, unopened. That meant he was thinking rather than merely existing. Well, he said. I laid the copies on his desk and gave him the summary. Old deeds, private letters, survey references, collateral schedules, no collectible rarity on the surface, no market object to explain the room's silence, and every sign that the papers mattered not for beauty or sale but for sequence. He scanned the sheets with increasing disapproval. Yes, he said. As expected. That phrase is beginning to get under my skin. You may endure it. The value is not in the paper. It is in what the paper proves. That was my thought. Number it is now your instruction. Follow it. So I did. The Ashford house had become more irritated. Since yesterday, there is no other word for it. Great houses under scandal lose their grandeur, first in the servants' movements, then in the family's voices, and finally in the way clocks sound. The front hall clock at Ashford now struck as if it wanted indemnity. I began in the library because dead lawyers leave better atmospheres than notes. Graham Vale had died there after staying behind with the papers, which meant he had reached something in them that changed fear into urgency. Kramer's men had removed the body, the glass and most of the excuses, but the room still looked as it had the evening before, orderly on the surface, strained beneath it. Clara Ashford was already there, seated at the long table with a stack of old family correspondence beside her, and the expression of a woman who had discovered that inheritance is merely archaeology with bills attached. You're back, she said. I keep getting invited by corpses. That's vulgar. Yes, that's why I'm here. She gave me one of those direct looks of hers that made me think, not for the first time, that if she had been born male, she would now own half of Pennsylvania and apologize for none of it. I've been going through what remains, she said. The old house files, the memoranda my grandfather kept, and the family letters no one burned because everyone thought someone else had. Useful. Disgusting. That's near enough. She slid 3 sheets toward me. They were copies made this morning by one of Kramer's men before the originals were bagged. The first was a deed abstract from 1898 involving a narrow row parcel on East 67th. The second was a trust notation from 1906 referencing a transfer of maintenance obligation without public filing of title. The third was a private letter from an Ashford uncle to a banker complaining that the North holdings must remain layered, or the whole arrangement invites inquiry. Layered, I said. Yes, that's not sentimental. Number, what are the North holdings? She leaned back. Pieces, lots, rear access strips, carriage, house rights, service lanes. One row property bought through a cousin's widow and sold through a church trust 3 years later. Nothing grand enough individually to attract notice together. An arrangement. That was good. I dislike arrangements in proportion to how politely they are described. None publicly recorded straight through. Apparently not, or not all the way. That seems to have been the point. There it was. Properties had changed hands without ever being publicly recorded in a manner visible to one honest eye. Ownership had gone through shadows, trust names, caretaker names, maintenance entities, memorial endowments, marital settlements, and one foundation whose respectable title concealed what must have been an appetite for alleys. I looked again at the letter. The value was not in the paper, but in what it proved. That title had traveled quietly, deliberately, and in forms designed to avoid sunlight. Who knew this? I asked. My grandfather. Then Graham Vale, because family lawyers become undertakers for facts. Gerard, partially. Me, not until yesterday, or not enough until yesterday. Her mouth moved, enough to feel cheated, not enough to understand the machinery. That's a good domestic definition of old money. She almost smiled. And now I want the machinery. Gerard Ashford provided some of it unwillingly. I found him in the old smoking room, standing by the cold hearth, and drinking whiskey at an hour when whiskey had ceased to be decorative. He disliked me before I opened my mouth, which saved time. You again? Yes. How many North properties are there? He made a face. If you mean the old chain, 7 principal parcels, and some subordinate rights. That was too fast for ignorance. I'm not ignorant. I'm only tired of being questioned by men who enjoy it. That lets out most of Manhattan. He put the glass down harder than the furniture deserved. The North chain was assembled privately because Ashfords used to prefer discretion to publicity. There were service properties, lodging rows, carriage connections, workshop easements. Some of it was bought through agents because public acquisition would have inflated adjacent prices. Some came through settlements, some through debt, some through trusts, yes, some through churches. He looked at me sharply. Who told you that? Nobody, I read. That was partly true, and therefore more annoying. He turned away, then back. A memorial trust held one parcel for a period. It was easier administratively. That's lawyer language for camouflage, he shrugged. Call it what you like. I call it motive in a frock coat. That got me a glare good enough to preserve. I pressed him on Graham Vale. He admitted Vale had handled the North papers for years and had repeatedly urged quiet consolidation, by which he meant keeping all public filings partial until one clean reorganization could be accomplished under favorable tax treatment. That was another way of saying no one wanted a straight public chain because a straight public chain invites questions from people paid to count lot lines honestly. And Hollis Crew? I asked. Gerard's mouth hardened. Crew began asking those questions. He had backed one development fund that touched the lower end of the chain, and then found the upper end depended on old transfers, never properly aired. After that, he wanted in or over. By force. By paper first. That matched St. Jude's too well to ignore from Gerard. I went back to Pelham Voss, because auctioneers know the practical side of value better than families do. He was in the rear room overseeing crates and doing his best to look as if dead staff and missing lots were merely poor weather. Tell me why nobody bid, I said. He sighed. Must we? Yes. He gestured at a crate, and I sat on it because the chair was occupied by his resentment. That box held papers, he said. Not decorative letters, not autographs of historical market value, not maps suitable for framing, not first edition nonsense papers. In an ordinary estate sale, those fetch less than the box carrying them, unless they touch title, scandal, or money not yet dead. This lot touched all three. Yes, yes. Did you know that before the sale? I suspected enough. Graham Vale urged withdrawal. Gerard Ashford went pale at the lot number. Clara Ashford stayed too calm. 3 dealers asked to see the catalogue notation twice. That is what in my profession we call bad atmosphere. You sold through it anyway. Of course, I am an auctioneer, not a chaplain. He had a point. The pattern was now plain enough to offend even me. The box had contained nothing rare, nothing collectible on the surface. But the names in the documents traced ownership through shadows, old trusts, maintenance entities, memorial funds, private settlements, collateral schedules, and side parcels, that together formed a chain someone had worked very hard to keep from standing in daylight under its own name. The missing box now meant exactly this: proof, not accusation, not rumor, proof. I took that back to Wolf in the late afternoon. He heard me through, without interruption, which is always a compliment disguised as economy. I laid out Clara's copies, Gerard's admission, Voss's atmosphere, and the shape of the North holdings assembled through private instruments and never publicly run straight through. When I was done, Wolf shut his eyes and rested his fingertips together. At last, he said, the object behaves according to intelligence. That's very nearly praise. Number it is relief. The box contained papers without a market price, because the market was never the point. Their value lay in sequence, hidden ownership, and the ability to collapse the false appearance of independence among the parcels. In short, they proved. Yes, Hollis Crew wanted them for leverage. Yes, Graham Vale feared them because they converted quiet family arrangements into vulnerable chains. Yes, and someone else wanted them because if publicly read, the papers would turn shadows into owners. Yes. Wolf opened his eyes. Good. Tomorrow you will learn precisely who that someone is. That sounds like a full morning. It should also. Archie, one does not lay a title unless one fears clear ownership. That one stayed with me later. At my window, I looked down at the street and thought about paper. The room at the auction had judged lot 47 worthless, because admitting its value would have meant admitting what the value was. Not rarity, not beauty, not sentiment. Proof that land had moved in darkness for years under names not meant to survive. Scrutiny properties had changed hands without public straightness. Families had used shadows as ledgers. Lawyers had called it structure. Donors and developers had called it stewardship. Hollis Crew had called it opportunity, and somewhere in that stack of old deeds and private letters lay the reason 2 men were dead and a box had vanished, as if paper itself had grown legs. Chapter 5. The estate that hid its own history by 5 o'clock. That afternoon I had learned enough about the Ashfords to know that if the family had ever possessed a motto, it was probably something in Latin, meaning leave it in a drawer and deny memory. Old New York families do not survive by honesty. They survive by upholstery, trustees, and the selective burial of facts embarrassing to the dead and expensive to the living. The Ashford estate had not been built on wealth alone. Wealth only paid for the stone. What held the thing together was discretion. Wolf said so in his own fashion when I reported to him before going back out. Archie, fortunes are not preserved. They are edited. That sounds severe. It is mild. Go learn what was removed from the manuscript. So I went back east to the Ashford house, where the manuscript in question had clearly undergone revisions extending over half a century. The place looked grander from the street than from within, which is often true of houses and nearly always true of reputations. The Afiade still had that heavy old confidence: limestone, steps, ironwork, and windows that seemed to expect deference from traffic. Inside, once you had passed the portraits and carpet, the structure of the family began showing through in the usual way: locked cabinets, side passages, old paper in side rooms, and servants who answered questions the way people cross ice. Clara Ashford met me in the morning room with a sheaf of copied letters and the expression of a woman who had stopped being surprised and had moved on to contempt. "You were right," she said. "That happens in small doses." About what? The estate wasn't merely kept private. It was designed private. That sounds expensive. It was cheaper than scandal. She handed me the letters, private correspondence, mostly between Ashford men and bankers, lawyers, or cousins, with titles. But no ballast. The tone was the same throughout, calm, coded, and mean in the polite way that old money prefers because vulgarity admits appetite. They wrote of temporary holds, nominee ownership, maintenance conveyances, protective silence, and family accommodations. The words changed, the purpose didn't. One letter from 1911, written in a hand dry enough to have been born wearing gloves, said the North parcels are to remain disconnected in appearance. Continuity invites inquiry, fragmentation reassures. That one I read twice because now and then a liar writes more clearly than an honest man speaks. I looked up. Who taught them that? No one. They inherited it. That's discouraging. Yes, the North chain had grown clearer and therefore more dangerous. Not in one deed, or one trust, or one transfer, in accumulation. A service lot, put in the name of a cousin's widow, a carriage house carried under a maintenance society, a row parcel held under chapel memorandum, a rear access strip tied to memorial upkeep, a small commercial lot managed by a foundation that had no public office and no recorded telephone. Every piece by itself looked like prudence, tax caution, or family untidiness. Together, they made a concealed line of control running north from the Ashford house through properties no one outside the arrangement would ever think to count as one thing. The value of the missing box was now plain enough to hurt. It connected all of it. Who knew the full chain? I asked. Graham Vale, mostly. Gerard in fragments. My grandfather entirely. My father not enough to be dangerous. After him, no one openly, which is why the box mattered. Because it proved continuity. Yes, because if continuity is proved, ownership stops hiding. Yes, I liked her for saying yes to things the first time. Gerard Ashford entered, without knocking, which was either family privilege or a lack of breeding disguised. As one he had changed coats and not temper. You again? Yes, we're getting domestic. He looked at the papers in Clara's lap, and then at me. I told you enough yesterday. Yesterday you told me the North chain existed. Today you tell me who had reason to bury it. His jaw worked once. Every own, that's broad. That is because old arrangements have many dependents. He was not wrong. That made him more annoying. I took him through it carefully. The concealed chain meant unpaid claims somewhere. Erased claims, likely. Quiet agreements that had served the Ashfords and then been forgotten by everybody except the documents. Public straightening of title would invite challenge, tax review, trust collapse, maybe criminal inquiry if enough of the transfers had been knowingly disguised. Even if nothing rose to prosecution, enough would rise to ruin the family's confidence, which in old houses is treated almost as a public utility. Gerard heard me out and then said, "The box should have been burned years ago." Clara turned her head and looked at him as if he had just announced a preference for murdering pets. "There," I said. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me." He ignored Clara, which took practice, and addressed me. "You think this is about greed. It's about preservation." "No," I said. "Preservation is what museums claim after they've stolen a roof. This is about keeping clear title from ever standing upright." That landed. He hated it for being exact. He moved to the window and stood there with his back half, turned, the posture of a man who wants to deny a thing and knows denial would now require labor. "The Ashford estate was built on more than money," he said. "It was built on quiet settlements, family failures, debts folded inward, claims persuaded to vanish. Some of it was ugly, some of it was mercy. It is easy, 50 years later, to call all concealment theft. I didn't call it all theft. What did you call it? History with a hand over its mouth. That was good enough to keep. He took it badly, which improved its value. From Gerard, I went where such things always lead, to the old records room in the rear of the house, where dead paper waits to embarrass blood. A servant named Haskins unlocked it for me with the reluctance of a man who believed keys themselves possessed family feeling. He was around 60, narrow in the chest and correct in the spine, and he had served the Ashfords long enough to have become one of those household fixtures nobody notices until they begin hearing too much. "You've been here a long time," I said. "Yes, sir. Long enough to know which papers matter." "I know which papers upset people. That's close enough." The room smelled of paste, dust and old carpet, shelves to the ceiling, tin deed boxes, flat files, locked cabinets, one long table under the window. It was not a room intended for use. It was intended for custody. There's a difference, and it usually has a lawyer in it. I asked Haskins about Graham Vale. "He came often, sir. Alone, usually. And took boxes. Sometimes. Lot 47, that made him blink. I never knew the sale number, sir." "But you knew the box?" "Yes, sir." "Who handled it before the sale?" "Mr. Vale, then Mr. Pell from the auction rooms. That sharpened things. That one I appreciated. At least he was making the effort in the right direction. I asked whether he had known before the sale that the lot might contain old deeds or private letters tied to the Ashford North properties. He denied precise knowledge, and I believed him, but only because his ignorance had the right shape. He knew enough to fear the lot, and not enough to buy it blindly against a room that had already been instructed. Then I asked the question Wolf would have asked sooner. "Why did you not bid one token amount anyway? $10.20, enough to test the room." That did it. The confidence cracked, not into panic, but into irritation, which is how well-bred men confess they were afraid. "Because," he said, "I am not a fool." That's broad. A bid on lot 47 would not have been a purchase attempt. It would have been a declaration of alignment. I had no wish to be aligned to the Ashford family's buried troubles in public. "Buried troubles," I repeated. "That's romantic. It's practical." "Yes, especially now that 2 men are dead." He looked at me fully then for the first time. "I had nothing to do with those deaths." "I didn't say you did. Number, but you hoped I'd hear it anyway. Usually people hear what helps them. I save time." He leaned back. "Then save some now." Graham Vale was nervous before the sale began, not merely cautious. Nervous. He wanted the lot to pass and believed it would if the right men in the room understood the cost of curiosity. That is why he spoke quietly to Fenn, to me, and to one museum representative. He was ceding indifference. I liked that enough to repeat it. Ceding indifference, yes. So the silence did not happen by accident. Number, and not by the room's instinct alone. Number. Summon and ensured the lot would remain untouched. Yes, that was the sentence I had come for, though I stayed longer to make sure it wore its proper clothes. I pressed him on the practical effect. If the lot passed unsold, what then? Voss would have returned it to the estate inventory. Graham Vale, as family counsel, could have arranged its quiet withdrawal later without public paper or commercial attachment. No bidder, no invoice, no sale record beyond past, no outsider with a receipt and therefore a claim to contents or disclosure, just one more family object returned to private custody. "And instead," I said. "Instead," Dane replied, summoning panicked when private custody became uncertain. That was as clean as I was likely to get from him. Before I left, I asked one final thing. "Mr. Dane, did you see anyone else in the room who knew more than he admitted?" That brought the slightest hesitation of the morning, and because it was slight, it mattered. "Yes," he said at last, "Clara Ashford." "In what way?" "She did not fear the lot as a buyer fears trouble. She feared it as someone fears recognition. There's a difference. She knew it belonged to a structure, not merely a scandal. That improved Clara and worsened the field at the same time, which is the usual exchange rate in homicide. When I got back to West 35th, Wolf was in the office with beer and disapproval, ready in equal measure. I gave him Lucas Dane straight through, dealer of high competence. No bid, no hesitation, quiet warning from Graham Vale before the sale. Ceded indifference among key men in the room, lot understood as strategic value rather than collectible value. A bid treated as declaration rather than purchase. And Clara Ashford, knowing more than mere family embarrassment, would explain. When I finished, Wolf shut his eyes and said, "Yes, I'm beginning to expect that. Number, you are beginning to deserve it." He opened one eye. The dealer confirms what the room already implied. The silence was cultivated. Graham Vale wanted the lot passed so it could return to private custody, uncontested. Therefore the box was dangerous. Not merely because of contents, but because public bidding would have created a lawful outsider. That's what Dane said, only in better cloth. Tepfu, cloth is irrelevant. Logic is not. I sat down, so the bid no one made was the point. Yes, a passed lot leaves no purchaser to examine, publish or assert rights. It disappears politely, until someone dies in the corridor over it. Yes, that is where politeness failed. He reached for the beer at last and opened it. That meant the thought had ripened enough to drink beside. "Archie," he said, "when a room full of people all neglect the same object by instruction, the instruction matters more than the object. Now find who benefited most from that instruction working." I went upstairs later with the city yellow under wet lamps and Dane's sentence still working in my head. A bid on lot 47 would not have been an attempt to buy. It would have been a declaration, which meant the room had understood the stakes well enough to stay quiet, and someone, Graham Vale first, perhaps someone else deeper, had worked hard to make sure it stayed that way. The lot had been flagged before the auction, not publicly, not crudely, just enough for the right people to pass it by without appearing to do so. That kind of silence does not form on its own. It is planted, tended, and paid for. Chapter 8. The archivist who read too much by then, the case had developed one of Wolf's favorite diseases. Too many people who knew a little, one or two who knew enough, and at least one who had already died from trying to improve the ratio. The morning after I saw Lucas Dane, Wolf sent me out again with that large calm of his, which means the machinery is nearly assembled, and he is now waiting for me to stop being decorative and bring him the last pin. "Archie," he said, "the box was dangerous in 3 stages. First when it existed, second when it was understood, and third when it vanished. You have dealt with the room and the dealer. Now, find the person who knew the contents before the room had been instructed how not to want them." That sounds promising. It sounds overdue. Who? The cataloger, the sorter, the drudge with eyes. Estates do not label themselves. Someone opened lot 47 before the sale. That was exact, and therefore I went looking for the person who had first read what others later feared. Her name was Ella Rowe. I got it from Pelham Voss with less difficulty than expected. Auctioneers are like surgeons in one useful respect. Once enough blood has appeared, they become much less precious about who sees the chart. "Miss Rowe handled preliminary inventory," he said. "House papers, minor lots, desk contents, books, the usual debris families are astonished to discover they have accumulated for 100 years. And where is she?" "At the estate this morning, I think. Rear workroom. She wanted to compare some shelf marks from the schoolroom cabinets with my office list." He looked at me a second longer than politeness required. "Goodwin, if she has read too much, try not to alarm her before you've made her useful. That's almost charitable. Number. It's practical. I've lost one man already." I found Ella Rowe in the old nursery schoolroom at the back of the 2nd floor, a long, narrow chamber that had once housed maps, French primers, punishments, and eventually unmarketable Ashford property of another kind. The room still had faded wallpaper with ships on it, and a high cabinet wall where family history had been shelved, in the hope that dust would make it unimportant. She was standing on a short ladder, not tall enough to make the work dignified, with a stack of inventory slips in one hand and a pencil in the other. 30 perhaps. Plain face, fair hair pulled back efficiently, grey skirt, dark cardigan, and the expression of a woman who had long ago accepted that most of the things she noticed would go unthanked. Her mouth was firm, but not hard. Her eyes, when she looked down at me, were the sort that had been forced by profession to keep taking in more than safety recommended. "Miss Rowe?" "Yes." "Archie Goodwin." That's supposed to mean something to me. It usually does by the second corpse. that got her attention, not fear exactly measurement. She came down the ladder carefully, set the slips on a school desk and said, "Mr. Voss sent you. That spares us both half a chapter." She did not smile. Some people improve when they refuse to. "You catalogued the estate before the sale began," I said. "Yes." "You saw lot 47 before anyone else in the room." One of several people, Mr. Voss reviewed all doubtful lots. "Number he reviewed after you opened. I want your first look." That landed. She leaned one hip against the desk and folded her arms, not defensively, but because she had realized the conversation had already gone beyond inventory. "Lot 47 came out of the north schoolroom cabinet," she said. "No shelf card, no family notation, no recent handling. At least not recent enough to be visible at first glance." At first glance, yes. So there was a second. There usually is if one means to keep one's position. That I liked. I asked her what she found. She gave it to me plainly enough that I almost believed the plainness was complete. A wooden casket with tied paper bundles inside, old deeds, trust references, private letters, survey fragments, memoranda on folded foolscap, and a ledger booklet. Not aesthetically valuable. No market object value except to the parties compromised by reading. Compromised is a good word. It was the first one that occurred. "That improved her," I said. "Did you tell Voss at once?" "Yes." "And he said the lot should be handled as family archives unless something in it created marketable distinction. Did it?" "Number. That's a bad answer. It's the exact answer for a public catalogue." "Yes," I said. "Now give me the private one." That took a second. "Not over a box of papers," he said. "Over jewels." "Yes. Over paintings with uncertain export histories, certainly. Over stolen silver once. But not over paper unless the paper threatens living people. Dead people don't buy influence, living ones do." That was good. Good enough to take home, but before I went home, I wanted the family version stripped of legal perfume. Clara Ashford gave it to me from the window seat in the old schoolroom, where the box had supposedly lain forgotten for 20 years, which is the sort of thing families say when they mean we forgot it only in public. "The room knew enough," she said. "Not enough to know contents, enough to know the lot should not be brought into sunlight by an outsider." "Who taught them that?" "Graham, mostly. Gerard by temperament. The room simply obeyed the stronger caution." That makes it sound like a dance. It was a family one. You didn't bid either. "Number. Why?" For the first time all day she did not answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, then toward the dark cabinet where some long-dead Ashford child had once kept maps or punishments or both. "Because if I had bid," she said, "I would have declared myself against the structure without yet knowing how to destroy it. And because I knew Gerard would read the bid as war. That was honest enough to be painful." "Did Graham want the lot passed?" I asked. "Yes. So he could recover it privately." "Yes. And then he stayed behind with it and died." Her mouth tightened. "Yes. I went from Clara to Gerard, who was back by then and in worse humor than before, which was an achievement. He did not deny the silence either. He denied only my right to describe it well. Everyone understood the thing was private." "Not everyone," I said. "Some only understood that you did." He gave me a hard look. That was sufficient. "For what?" "To keep fools from attaching themselves to family paper." "There," I said. "That's your mistake. You think silence merely protected family paper. It protected something else." He knew I had him near enough to matter, because his face changed from contempt to calculation. "What?" "Ownership that can't stand being named aloud. That one landed because it had weight, and he knew it. By the time I got back to the brownstone, the case had become simple in the way only complicated cases ever do. Not easy, never that. But simple in shape. The silence at lot 47 had not formed on its own. It had been prepared by Graham Vale's cautions, reinforced by Gerard Ashford's presence, obeyed by dealers who smelled title contamination, and completed by a room smart enough to know that the first paddle raised would become a public declaration of private interest. I told Wolf all of it in the office, while Fritz moved through the hall, announcing dinner with smells rather than words. When I finished, Wolf shut his eyes and nodded once. Yes, I know. Number this time you may keep the approval. He rested his fingertips together. The bid no one made was itself evidence. No one in that room wished to be publicly attached to the contents, which means the contents threatened not merely one person but a network of understanding. Silence like that requires either instruction or fear. Here it had both. Graham taught the room to avoid it. Yes. Gerard enforced it by existing. Yes. Clara obeyed because she knew bidding would start a war. Yes. Wolf opened his eyes. Therefore the silence around Lot 47 was a social mechanism, not an accident. Someone in the room had conducted it, and when the box failed to disappear quietly, murder began. I sat back. That's cheerful. Number that is structure. Later, at my window, I looked down at the street and thought about how many ways people refuse to raise a hand. In auction rooms, it is usually about money. In families, it is usually about blame. At Ashford, it had been about something rarer and much more dangerous. A room full of people all understanding, to varying degrees, that one little box of papers must be permitted to vanish without witness. No one had bid, no one had been surprised, no one had broken the spell, and silence like that, disciplined, mutual, expensive, never forms on its own. It has to be taught. Chapter 7. The dealer who looked away. If you want the truth about value, do not ask a collector. Collectors are romantics with storage problems. Do not ask a museum man. He will give you morality padded with acquisition budgets. Ask a dealer. A real dealer knows what a thing is worth, what it is worth pretending not to want, and what it may cost to touch before the room agrees you were entitled to it. At the Ashford sale, Lucas Dane had known all three. I got his name from Pelham Voss after dinner the night before, when the auctioneer had at last stopped, trying to preserve everyone's dignity, and settled for preserving only his invoices. You've spoken to Fenn, Voss had said. Speak to Dane. Why? Because Fenn sniffs the weather. Dane measures the storm. That sounded theatrical, but auctioneers are allowed a little stage language if they earn it. So the next morning I took a cab downtown to East 27th Street, where Lucas Dane kept a gallery office and private counting, house under one elegant roof. The front room held lacquer cabinets, gilt mirrors, 2 marble busts no one had loved properly in 200 years, and one assistant who looked as if my tie had offended him morally. Mr. Dane is occupied. Tell him Archie Goodwin is here, about the Ashford lot. That changed the assistant's expression from professional dislike to professional alarm, which was an improvement in vigor, if not warmth. He disappeared through a velvet curtain and came back in less than a minute. Mr. Dane will see you. Lucas Dane had made himself into the kind of man rich widows trust with furniture and distrust with their nieces. 45 perhaps, dark hair going silver at the exact temples, neat hands, excellent grey suit, and a voice cultivated to sound as though every statement had already survived legal review. He sat behind a desk too old to be tasteful and too good to be sold, with a little Chinese bronze beside his elbow, and a ledger open but unwritten in front of him. Mr. Goodwin, he said, I understand you've been moving through yesterday's company like influenza. That suggests I'm memorable. It suggests you arrive where one would rather not be examined. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me today. He did not smile. Men like Lucas Dane never smile unless money requires it or another man has just embarrassed himself expensively. I sat without invitation because in a dealer's office waiting to be asked is just another form of bargaining. At the Ashford sale, I said, lot 40. 7 came up, a small wooden box listed obscurely and sold as found. You looked at it. You did not bid, and unlike half the room, you knew enough to make that omission interesting. He lifted one eyebrow, measured distance. You give me too much credit. Number, I ration it. Let's begin smaller. You're one of the best furniture and object men in the city. You omitted several names. Yes, I was being kind to you. That almost drew a smile, but only almost. He folded his hands. Proceed. You passed on the lot, without hesitation. Yes. Why? Because it had no commercial attraction for me. That's a bad answer. It happens to be true. Number, it happens to be tidy. There's a difference. He glanced at the bronze by his elbow, then back at me. Mr. Goodwin, a modest wooden box of uncertain date and no decorative significance is not my field. That's the catalogue speaking again. I'm tired of the catalogue. Tell me what you saw. This time there was a pause long enough to count. Under pressure, confidence often cracks loudly. With Dane it only shifted 1 degree, the way a cufflink shifts when the wrist beneath it tightens. I saw an object carrying family risk, he said. That's better. Not much. It's enough to keep you in the chair. How did you know it carried risk? His eyes narrowed a fraction. Because the room did. That's cowardly. Try again. No, he said, and the voice cooled. It's observational. Before the lot came up, Graham Vale spoke to Pelham Voss, then to Osric Fenn, then to me, not at length, not directly, but with sufficient emphasis to make clear that bidding on Lot 47 would not be treated as ordinary commercial behavior. There it was. I said nothing because silence is useful when the other man has at last begun paying rent in truth. Dane continued. He described the lot as family archival matter, legally untidy, with no proper marketability and a high likelihood of later dispute. And that persuaded you. It warned me, persuasion is gentler. What exactly did he say? He thought about that. Men with good memories are often careful because they know accuracy can become testimony. More or less this. Mr. Dane, there will be an item this afternoon better left to the family and of no trade use to men of discretion. That's Graham Vale all over. Even his threats, wear gloves. Dane inclined his head. He was not threatening me. He was inviting me to be intelligent. Same thing, in different tailoring. I let that settle and then said, you still looked at the box when it came up. Yes, you still understood value. Yes. What value? He exhaled once through the nose. Not decorative value. Not sale value. Strategic value. That was good. Very good. I wrote it down. Strategic for whom? For anyone wishing to establish or destroy a paper chain. Title. Possibly. Not possibly, certainly. His mouth moved slightly. You have progressed. I get that way if no one shoots me. He turned a page in the open ledger without reading it. The box had no price because its worth depended on what it could prove and to whom. There, you're almost being useful. I'm trying not to be. Did anyone object? His face did the slight inward thing. Servants' faces do when they have decided. Loyalty must now be translated into a mission. I waited. Silence with servants is like poker with priests. Patience matters more than cards. At the time, he said at last, Miss Clara asked whether that particular box ought properly be catalogued. Mr. Vale said yes. Mr. Gerard said no. Mr. Vale said no object in the house could be excluded, merely because it made the family nervous. Mr. Gerard said some objects were private. Mr. Vale said private was often only another word for delayed difficulty. That sounded like Graham Vale, and also like a man who knew enough to be killed later for revising his own courage. Was that all? No, sir. Go on. Mr. Pell asked, as he was carrying it off, whether there was anything breakable inside. Mr. Vale said, nothing breakable, only connective. That one gave me a chill pleasant enough to count as progress. Connective, yes, that was precisely what the missing box had been. Not treasure, not sentiment. Connection, links among deeds, rights, trusts, letters, nominee holdings, and erased claims. The estate had hidden its own history by breaking it into polite fragments. The box had reassembled them. Summoner had worked very hard to keep those links buried. Summoner had just killed twice to keep them that way. I took one more pass through the room, and found the practical version of discretion in 3 tin boxes filed under separate names, but all referring to the same rear easement line by different descriptions. One called it North Service Accommodation, another Chapel Maintenance Lane, the third Adjacent Support Strip. Same measurements, same boundary turns, different purposes assigned, depending on who needed the fiction at the time. There are cases where the evidence leaps. This was not one. It layered quietly, expensively, and with enough old legal perfume to make robbery sound like stewardship. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolf was where my sins had left him, in the office, with his desk lamp making order look easy. I gave him the family letters, the disguised chain, Gerard's wish that the box had been burned, Haskins's account of the argument before cataloguing, and Graham Vale's line about the box containing nothing breakable, only connective. At that, Wolf's eyes opened wider than usual. "Yes," he said. "I know. Number now, I mean it properly." He tapped the copied letter about fragmentation reassuring and continuity inviting inquiry. The estate was built on discretion, because discretion concealed structure. The concealed structure was the fortune, not the visible house, not the silver, not the portraits, not the auctions. Those are decoration. The real inheritance lay in hidden continuity among parcels and rights. Lot 47 threatened to make the invisible visible, which is why the room let it pass. Yes, which is why Marcus Pell died when it left the room, which is why Graham Vale died when he understood what reading it aloud might do. I sat meaning. Meaning the killer is not merely protecting one parcel or one secret. He is protecting the entire architecture of concealment. That was Wolf in form. Not content to find the gun, he wanted the grammar behind it, I said. The estate hid its own history. Of course, that is what estates do when history is costly. He leaned back. "Archie, tomorrow you will discover who among them benefits most. Not from ownership itself, but from ownership remaining unprovable." That one stayed with me later at my window, with the city below shining damp and temporary, while old money 2 miles away was busy pretending permanence. The Ashford estate had been built on wealth. Yes, but wealth was merely the wallpaper. Under it were land transfers, quiet agreements, erased claims, family accommodations, service lanes renamed 3 times, chapel holdings used as sleeves, and enough discretion to keep the whole structure from ever having to introduce itself plainly. The missing lot connected all of it. That was why the room had ignored it. That was why the lawyer had stayed behind with it. That was why someone had killed to keep those links buried. And once you know that, the house changes shape. It is no longer a mansion with secrets in it. It is a secret with a mansion built around it. Chapter 6, the bid no one made by noon. The next day I had interviewed enough rich people to develop a sincere respect for burglars. Burglars at least admit they are interested in objects. Collectors, heirs, museum men, dealers and family solicitors will spend 3/4 of an hour explaining why they did not want a thing, and then another quarter explaining why no one else ought to have had it either. Wolf, after hearing my report on the hidden north chain and the Ashford family's architectural devotion to secrecy, had sent me back out with a phrase that stuck like a tack in the shoe. "Archie, the silence at Lot 47 was not social, it was functional. Learn who arranged its function." That sounds like asking people who taught them not to blink. Then watch their eyelids. That is Wolf all over. He never wastes elegance where discomfort will do. So I went again to the Ashford house where the auction chairs were now gone, but the atmosphere had remained behind to pay rent. The ballroom looked much larger without bidders in it, and much meaner without money, pretending to be appetite. A few servants were taking inventory of the things nobody had yet claimed. Pelham Voss was in the rear office doing arithmetic with murder on top of it. Gerard Ashford had gone out, which improved the ventilation. Clara Ashford was somewhere upstairs with the family correspondence, and the expression of a woman excavating her own surname with a spoon. I began with the registered bidders one by one, starting in the house and then by telephone, where distance had not improved honesty. By the 6th conversation I had enough to know that Wolf had been right. The room's silence had not been accidental. It had been shared, recognized, and obeyed. Mr. Osric Fenn, dealer, repeated what he had told me before in cleaner form and dirtier spirit. I had no interest in the lot. No, I said. You had no interest in being the first man to admit interest in the lot. His eyes dried out another shade. That distinction pleases you. It helps me. He sighed, elegant as dust. Very well. The thing had family vapor around it, one could tell. The lawyer had moved through the room before the sale began, and had spoken quietly to several people. That is always a sign either of authenticity trouble or inheritance rot. Neither improves bidding. What did he say? Nothing direct. Only that some lots had no commercial future and that professional caution would be appreciated. Professional caution, I said. That's a lovely phrase for coordinated fear. Fenn did not deny it. The museum men improved it further. Bromley from the Metropolitan protested first, then surrendered in stages like a country with weak borders. Yes, Vale said. The lot was archival rather than collectible. Which meant? It meant it might involve title material, family papers, or matters likely to become contested. So you let it pass. Yes. Without surprise. Surprise is for amateurs, Mr. Goodwin. Kester from the smaller museum was less polished, and therefore more useful, he told me. After 3 minutes of defensive history and one of coughing, that when Lot 47 was announced he had actually half raised his paddle. Then he saw not one but 4 people in the room deliberately fail to do the same. Which 4? Gerard Ashford, of course, Graham Vale, that dealer Fenn, and the woman in black. Clara. Yes, they all had the same look. What look? He hesitated, embarrassed by his own honesty. The look people have when they know bidding would not be treated as bidding. That one I carried straight to the notebook. It was not just caution. Then, it was social warning. The room had agreed without speaking to let the lot disappear. Some understood why. Others understood only enough to imitate the wiser panic around them. That is how expensive rooms enforce discipline, not by instruction, but by atmosphere, until fear begins passing as etiquette. He found Pelham Voss in the library office, making notes over insurance forms that had no style at all. He looked up as I came in and said, "If you are here to ask whether auctioneers enjoy police attention, no, I'm here to ask who set the room. That is at least a professional question." He removed his spectacles and polished them, which told me the answer would cost him something. Voss was vain, not stupid. Men like that sell discretion as part of the hammer price and resent any inquiry suggesting they haven't controlled the room. Graham Vale spoke to at least 3 bidders before the sale, I said. Yes. Gerard Ashford knew the lot and wanted it gone. Yes. Clara Ashford knew what the box represented, or enough of it, perhaps. That's thin. It is the truth I possess. I let that pass because there are times when pressure only improves the opponent. When Lot 47 came up, were you surprised at the silence? Number because. Because by then I had already been warned that the lot carried no market interest. By Vale. Yes. Did you believe him? Number, but auctioneers do not require belief. We require explanation sufficient to understand whether a room is avoiding an object from contempt, litigation, or shared family cowardice. And your conclusion, that they feared the lot might attach a public bidder to private trouble. That did it. I asked him if, in all his years with estates and heirs and antique tables, he had ever seen a room behave quite like that. He thought a moment, then shook his head. Not because she had to decide whether to trust me, but because she was deciding how much she had already trusted herself. The papers contained inconsistencies, she said. In what? Dates, descriptions, signatures. Not forgeries, exactly. More like successive efforts to make separate transactions appear unrelated when they depended on one another. There, I said. That's better. She went on more quietly now. One deed referred to a maintenance lane not yet acquired in the later trust that supposedly explained it. Another memorandum treated a chapel holding as collateral before the chapel entity existed under that name. 2 letters from different years described the same rear strip with different dimensions but the same rent figure which suggested copied language over altered facts. And the ledger index had references to parcels not listed in the estate books under any Ashford title. It was one of those moments when the air in the room changes, not because anything visible has moved, but because a thing has finally been named by someone competent. Ella Rowe had not merely looked at the papers, she had read them. "And you understood this," I said. "Yes." "More than you admitted." "Yes." That too I liked. The trouble with her was that I began liking her too quickly, which in my line of work is almost always professional carelessness. "Did you tell anyone besides Voss?" She hesitated. I waited. "At first, no. Then Mr. Graham Vale came to review the catalogue sheets and asked whether any family paper lots had been assigned open description. I told him one box of private records was too mixed to classify cleanly. And he asked to see my working notes. "Did you show him?" "Yes." "What did he do?" "He read them. Then he said, 'Miss Rowe, that lot is not your concern beyond description.' That sounds like him." She nodded. Then he asked whether I had made copies. "Had you?" Another pause. Yes, there it was. Why? Because his face changed. That one was worth the trip by itself. How? Not surprise. Not annoyance, fear disguised as administration. I've seen it before in archives and probate rooms. Men don't mind old paper until it begins joining hands across time. That was nearly wolf-worthy. I moved closer to the desk and looked at the slips there. They were shelf lists, cabinet references, and lot descriptions in her neat hand. One slip, folded under the others, bore the number 47 and 3 short notes in pencil. North chain, not separate chapel, transfer proceeds. Trust filing Vale schedule conflicts with estate ledger. I touched the paper. "Your notes." "Yes." "You kept them?" "Yes." "Why?" She looked at me directly. "Because once Marcus Pell died, I understood that accuracy had become a private asset. That was as close to fear as she had come, and I believed it. I asked where the copies were. She did not answer at once. Then she said, 'Not here, good.' Is it?" "Yes, because if they were here, I'd have to decide whether to take them from you before someone else did, and my day is already full." That almost made her smile, but only almost. "Mr. Goodwin, if I give you those copies, do they go to the police?" "Eventually." "That is not comforting. Number comfort is not one of my saleable goods." She turned away, went to the cabinet wall, pulled out a geography primer with a broken spine, and shook from it a folded packet of onion, skin copies. There are moments when the entire city seems to reduce itself to paper between 2 fingers. That was one. I took the packet and read standing. Her copies were not complete reproductions of Lot 47. They were better. She had abstracted the connective tissue, names, dates, cross-references, parcel numbers, trust amendments, and the notes from the calf-bound ledger showing how pieces under apparently different ownership actually attached to one north line. Some parcels had changed hands without ever being publicly recorded in the same chain. Others had been parked in entities for months or years before sliding into quiet family use. And next to 3 entries she had penciled question marks where the dates made no legal sense unless the public paperwork had been arranged after practical control was already in place. "That's enough to collapse a neat story," I said. "Yes, and perhaps a title." "Yes." And Graham Vale read enough of this to know that. "Yes." "Did anyone else?" She folded her arms again. "Clara," Ashford asked, "why looked ill after he left?" I told her the lot was complicated. She said in this house complication was usually just guilt with filing boxes. That line had family tone all over it. I believed it at once. Did Gerard know? He knew there was paper trouble. I don't know how much he knew of the chain. And Marcus Pell? He knew only that the lot had become controversial after cataloguing. So Graham Vale understood the documents, more than anyone except perhaps their long-dead makers. "Yes, and you," I said. "Understood them more than you admitted." She gave me a dry look. "You keep repeating that as if I might be embarrassed by competence." I'm not that kind of man. No. Number, I'm the kind who worries when competence gets people killed. That got through to her more than the rest had. She sat down on the edge of the desk, suddenly, and without grace, which told me the strain had been there all along and had only now begun billing her for it. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "if Graham Vale died because he finally read what I had already seen, then possession wasn't the only danger. Number understanding was. Yes. That was the heart of it. Marcus Pell died because the box could be seized. Graham Vale died because he stayed with it long enough to understand what it threatened. Ella Rowe, if the killer had known what she had read and copied, might have joined the sequence. I folded the packet and put it inside my inner pocket. "You'll come with me," I said. Her head came up. "Where?" "To Nero, Wolf." That time she did smile a little, though not because she was pleased. "That sounds like either sanctuary or trial." "Yes," I said. "He often arranges them in one room." When I got her to the brownstone an hour later, Wolf was where civilization had left him. At his desk, with the yellow lamp on and the window open to a thread of spring air and motor noise. Fritz, after one look at Ella Rowe, produced coffee without being asked, which is how you can tell he approved of her shoes, or her fear, or both. I gave Wolf the broad version first, then the packet. He read the Onion, skin abstracts in silence. Halfway through, his eyes opened wider. At the end, he set them down and looked at Ella Rowe with the kind of attention that counts, from Wolf, as a public decoration. "You are competent," he said. She said, "That has become a disadvantage." "Yes." I sat down because there are some conversations better enjoyed from furniture. Wolf tapped one sheet. "Miss Rowe's notes establish what we only suspected. The papers in Lot 47 were not valuable for rarity, but for coherence. They connected parcels deliberately kept separate in public appearance. They showed private control preceding public legitimacy. They showed the chapel transfer and trust filings in false sequence. They showed that the Ashford North properties were not a collection of accidents, but a concealed chain," I said. "And she saw it before Graham Vale did." Wolf nodded. "Or at least before he admitted it to himself. That made her dangerous had the killer known it." Ella Rowe lifted the coffee cup, set it down again, and said, "Then perhaps he did." That improved the room by making it honest. Wolf looked at her. "Who else knew you had read more than the description required?" she thought. "Graham Vale." Pelham Voss suspected. I'd gone farther. Clara Ashford knew I had seen something serious. Gerard may have guessed. Marcus Pell knew only that the lot had become sensitive. Wolf grunted. "Good." Then the next step narrows. That meant he had already moved beyond her and into the machinery of the thing, with Wolf. That is not rudeness. It is justice of a specialized sort. Later, when Ella had gone to the front room to telephone someone and Fritz had carried in beer for Wolf and sandwiches for me, he said, "Archie, the archivist did not merely read too much. She read exactly enough. Remember that. In such cases, the danger is not possession of paper, but possession of sequence." "Yes." "And now we know who first understood the documents." "Yes." He took up the beer. "Good, we are nearly finished with ignorance." That was as encouraging as he gets before the shooting, and there had been no shooting yet. At the window afterward, with the city turning itself into lamps and reflections, I thought about Ella Rowe in the schoolroom, with her inventory slips and pencil and her bad habit of understanding what she saw. She had catalogued the estate before the sale began. She had opened Lot 47, when it was still only a box and not yet a motive. She had seen the contents before anyone else in the room, and her notes had caught what the family and lawyer most feared: inconsistencies not in decoration, but in sequence, ownership, and public legitimacy. The papers had no price on the market, but they could destroy a title, a story, and maybe a fortune. And in a case like that, understanding is just another form of possession, sometimes the most dangerous one. Chapter 9. The claim that could undo everything. By then, the case had ceased being about a box. That happens sometimes with objects in murder. They begin as furniture and end as grammar. Lot 47 had started life in my notes as a modest wooden casket passed over, in a rich room by people too disciplined to be curious in public. It had then graduated into a missing lot, a motive, a corridor scramble, a dead foreman, a dead lawyer, and an onion, skin packet in Wolf's hand. "No," Wolf said. "I am saying Graham Vale did not remain alive long enough to be that second murderer." That annoyed Kramer visibly, then stopped circling. Wolf did not look at him. The killer relied on one assumption, that because Graham Vale had spoken quietly against the lot before the sale, and because he was then found dead with the papers partly sorted, we would accept a neat progression. First he cultivated the silence, then he belatedly learned too much. Then he was removed by someone higher or harsher. It is tidy. It is also false. He tapped Ella Rowe's notes. Miss Rowe saw the papers first. She kept working notes. Graham Vale read them before the sale. He knew then, not later, that the chain could collapse if the papers were publicly connected. Therefore his supposed discovery in the library the next day is nonsense. He did not die because he finally understood. He died because someone needed the appearance of that. That landed where it ought to, not in Clara, not in Gerard, but in Pelham Voss. The auctioneer's face did not break, it thinned, Wolf said. "Mr. Voss, you had 3 advantages. First, you controlled access and movement at the sale. Second, you knew exactly when the lot would pass, where it would go afterward, and how to create confusion around unsold inventory. Third, and most importantly, you had long known the Ashford estate's hidden arrangements, because your firm had handled prior discreet dispersals and private sales tied to the same North chain. Graham Vale's warnings to the room were not merely for his benefit. They protected yours," Voss said very quietly. "That is absurd." "No," Wolf said, "only unpleasant. Marcus Pell worked for you. He knew enough to carry sort and inventory. When the blackout came, he became inconvenient because he had hands on the box during the transition from past lot to private removal. You killed him in the corridor scramble using the bronze paperweight because the struggle gave you cover." Voss gave the smallest shake of the head, almost admiringly. "Really, Mr. Wolf." Wolf ignored the performance. "Then, when Graham Vale insisted on reviewing the papers in the library, you faced greater danger. Not because he had newly understood the threat, but because he might decide, under pressure and after one death, to save himself by changing sides. He had already shown nervousness. He had already lost control of the room. In the library, he became a variable. You poisoned him before he could become a witness," Kramer said. "Poison." "Yes, the bitter, cordial glass, a simple continuation of his supposed scholarly review. Mr. Voss moved easily in the house, was known to the staff, and had ample occasion to carry refreshment without alarm. Once Graham Vale was dead, his prior role in cultivating the auction silence transformed him from conductor into victim, elegant, also stupid." At that Voss's mouth finally changed. "Not much. Enough," I said. "You also had the best reason to keep the North chain buried. If the claim blew open, those earlier discreet dispersals, the private handling, the side transfers through your clients, and related entities, all of it came under light. You weren't just selling from the estate. You had been part of the machinery that kept the estate's hidden structure safe." Mrs. Fenwick gasped with real pleasure. "She likes scandal best when properly invoiced." Wolf nodded at me. "Quite so. Mr. Voss had converted discretion into business over years. He was not merely an auctioneer at the end of the chain. He was one of its lubricants." Voss stood up then slowly. "You have no box," he said. "No ledger, no direct proof that I ever touched either corpse." Wolf opened his eyes fully, which is something he only does when he has stopped tolerating another man's vanity. "No," he said. "I have better. I have sequence, access, motive, and your own miscalculation. You allowed the lot to be catalogued rather than quietly disappear, because you believed the room could be made to pass it. When that worked, you attempted private recovery. When Pell interfered, you killed him. When Vale became unstable, you killed him too, and you omitted one thing. Voss did not answer. Wolf said, "Miss Rowe's notes." Ella Rowe went pale, then steadied. "Good girl," Wolf continued. "You believed the box itself held the danger. It did not. The danger lay in comprehension. Miss Rowe had already abstracted the critical links, enough to collapse your discretion. That is why you are here tonight, rather than safely at home pretending outrage over police inconvenience." Kramer had been slow for exactly as long as it took him to enjoy the paragraph. Then he moved. Stebbins moved faster. Voss took one step back, perhaps from habit rather than hope, and then stopped because there was nowhere in Wolf's office to become graceful under arrest. "Damn you," he said, not to Wolf, to Ella Rowe. She did not answer. She only looked at him the way archivists look at mildew. That was more satisfying than if she had slapped him. Stebbins took him out. Kramer followed after a final look at Wolf that combined irritation, admiration, and indigestion in proportions known only to the police and certain marriage counselors. When the door closed, the room loosened by degrees. Gerard Ashford sat down, as if somebody had quietly cut the strings in his back. Clara looked not relieved, exactly, but less burdened by the need to hate her own blood on schedule. Mrs. Fenwick sighed like a woman whose theatre ticket had finally paid off. Ella Rowe remained still and very pale. Wolf looked at Clara. "The estate will now endure lawyers of a different sort," she said, with dry precision. "We have earned them." "Yes," Wolf said, entirely. Gerard managed, "if the papers are gone." "They are not entirely gone," Wolf said. "Miss Rowe's copies survive. Enough survives. Whether the full chain is publicly litigated or privately settled is now your family's concern. Not mine. My concern was murder." That was Wolf all over. "He will untangle your life only as far as homicide requires, and then hand the rest back to you dripping." Clara turned to Ella. "You kept copies?" Ella said. "Yes." "Good. That was all." It was enough. After they had gone and Fritz had brought in late sandwiches, with the grim indulgence of a man who believes crime should at least justify kitchen inconvenience, I stood at the window with my coffee and looked down at West 35th. Rain had begun again, making the cabs look like guilty beetles under the lamps. Somewhere uptown, the Ashford house was still standing on stone, service lanes, erased claims, and the hopeful fiction that history remains buried if people stop naming it, Wolf said behind me. "Well," I turned. "The unsold lot solved it without ever coming back." "Yes, that's almost poetic. Number it is economical." I let that pass outside. The city went on being itself, wet, loud, inattentive, and full of things people think they can leave behind. But on East 68th Street, and anywhere else rich rooms teach themselves not to see what matters most. The truth has one vulgar habit. It waits. Then somebody dies. Then it comes out in copies, notes, glances, awkward pauses, and the one bid nobody made. Because the most dangerous things are rarely the jewels sold under light. They are the papers, claims, and small wooden boxes left behind in the hope that everyone important will go on ignoring them forever. In New York, that almost never works. By the time we reached the 9th chapter of the business, it was no longer an object at all. It was a claim. And if the claim was proved, the Ashford estate would not merely suffer inconvenience, it would come apart in the expensive places. Wolf had said so after reading Ella Rowe's abstracted copies, though naturally he had said it in his own fashion. "Archie, fortunes are resilient, titles less so, reputations least of all. If these papers prove what they suggest, the estate's visible wealth survives only after law, tax, and scandal have had their meal. The true catastrophe lies elsewhere, in legitimacy." That sounds judicial. It is anatomical. So I spent the morning doing what he required and what I dislike most, carrying facts to men paid, to explain why facts should have been phrased differently. In this case, that meant title counsel, registry clerks, one retired surveyor, and a probate man old enough to remember when Ashford still signed things as if the city had been built to hold their hats. By noon, the shape was plain enough to offend anyone who had ever trusted a deed. The missing papers tied the Ashford estate, legally and directly, to land it could not fully prove it had ever owned. Not in the straight, public, documentable way respectable property likes to imagine itself held. The north parcels, the service lane, the chapel easement, the carriage connection, the widow, held row strip, the maintenance trust parcel, all of them had been treated for decades as parts of one controlled chain, but the original right to consolidate them had never matured into clean title. An old claim lay underneath, not a romantic one, not a lost, fairy story, but something much worse. Valid interruption it began, as most expensive trouble does, with a settlement designed to avoid daylight. A century earlier, one parcel in the north chain had been held temporarily in trust pending a private family accommodation involving a child, a support arrangement, and a piece of land never meant to remain in public dispute. The Ashfords, with the help of lawyers who billed by euphemism, had proceeded afterward as though temporary control were eventual ownership. And eventual ownership need never be stated plainly so long as no one forced the sentence to completion. For years no one had. Then Hollis Crewe, nosing through adjacent development structures and church, holding irregularities, the way men like him nose, through any place where old softness may conceal exploitable value, had found the weak seam. He had realized that if the connective papers in Lot 47 were read aloud and set beside the public chain, one plain and brutal fact emerged. The Ashford estate had exercised control over land it could not prove it had ever legally acquired in full. Not all the land, enough of it. Enough that fortunes would collapse and reputations fracture, trying to explain the difference. I took that back to Wolf just before lunch. He was in the office, naturally, and because Fritz had not yet fed him, he was less patient than philosophy recommends, and more dangerous than most men become after whiskey. Ella Rowe was there too, seated in the red leather chair with her copied abstracts on her lap, and the expression of a woman who had decided she would rather be precise than comfortable. "Well," Wolf said, "I gave it to him straight, the old settlement a temporary trust, never fully regularized into public clean ownership. The parcels subsequently treated as joined through control, maintenance, and private agreement, but not through an uncontestable legal chain. The claim beneath the chain, the point at which public reading of the missing papers would convert Ashford continuity from confidence into litigation." When I finished, Wolf grunted once. "Yes. I was hoping for trumpets. Number this will do." He steepled his fingers and looked at Ella Rowe. "Miss Rowe, your note stopped where propriety would have preferred. Mr. Goodwin has now gone one step farther. The result is simple. The north chain was real in use and false in legal innocence. Therefore Hollis Crewe acquired leverage of the highest order." Ella nodded slowly. "He could force settlement by exposure." "Yes," Wolf said, "or control by preventing it. Men who discover structural weakness in old fortunes rarely publicize them at once. They first ask what silence is worth." I sat down. "Graham Vale must have seen that when he stayed behind in the library." "Yes. He was killed because he understood too late."
"Yes."
Mr. Vale likely believed he could review the contents, assess immediate danger, and then resume his accustomed profession of delay. Instead, he discovered urgency. There was the thing: Graham had not died because he possessed the box physically. Marcus Pell had done that first and less intelligently. Graham had died because he had read enough of the papers to know that if they escaped family custody and entered daylight in the wrong hands, the Ashford position collapsed, not in theory, but in sequence. He had uncovered the truth too late to protect himself from it, I said. So the killer acted from necessity. Wolf turned his head and gave me the look he reserves for occasions when I say something nearly worth keeping. "Yes," he said, "not legal necessity, moral necessity, or any necessity entitled to sympathy. Practical necessity." He had reached the point where permitting the box or its implications to live beyond private walls endangered too much of what he depended on. Kramer arrived 3 minutes later and improved the room in the way a bull improves a conservatory. He had rain on his shoulders, impatience in his face, and Stebbins behind him carrying a file thick enough to discourage democracy. "Well?" he barked. I'm told by title people, and one very nervous registry clerk, that the Ashfords may have been sitting on land they never closed properly 100 years ago, and then buried the gap under trusts, memorial nonsense, and paper smoke. I said, that's a little rough, but the bones are right. He glared at me because if he didn't, the day would lose continuity. Fine, so the box proves it, Wolf said. The box and the missing ledger likely prove enough to threaten. Yes, which is not the same as winning in court. But murder does not require certainty. It requires perceived catastrophe. Cramer grunted. That meant he understood and resented the distinction. Ella spoke then, quietly. Then the lot became valuable only when connected. Wolf nodded, precisely. Worthless on the surface. Deadly in context. That was lot 47 all over. A box of papers with no decorative glamour, no auction romance, no collector's appetite. And yet, once the contents were joined to sequence, dates, parcels, and public records, it became the most valuable secret in the room, not because anyone wished to own it, because everyone who mattered needed it not to exist in the wrong hands, Cramer said. Who gains most if those papers stay buried? Wolf ignored him, which is sometimes his cruelest answer. I asked the question differently. Who loses most if the claim is proved? Wolf looked at me. Better. Gerard Ashford loses continuity of possession, inherited authority, and perhaps large practical control. Clara Ashford loses wealth, though she gains honesty if she values it, which I doubt she prizes above breakfast. The chapel interests tied through memorial and maintenance structures lose standing. Mr. Voss loses only commissions and does not murder for them. Miss Rowe gains nothing by concealment. Graham Vale tried to manage the revelation and died. Therefore we seek the person for whom the old arrangement was not merely inheritance but active foundation. Cramer said, meaning Gerard. Wolf's eyelids lowered. Meaning perhaps Gerard. Do not lunge merely because the ground slopes in his direction. Men with inherited advantage often prefer lawyers to homicide. Val was a lawyer. Yes, Wolf said, and he died. That improved no one. I spent the afternoon where the answer was likely to ripen, the Ashford house under pressure. Once facts begin hardening, houses do strange things. Doors open to the wrong people. Servants remember details they had been loyal enough to forget. Cousins drink before dinner. Women stop protecting furniture from truth. Clara Ashford received me first. I gave her the simple version. If the missing papers were proved and paired to the public record, the North chain collapsed. Not all the estate, but enough of its authority to turn every old confidence into a legal bruise. She listened without interruption and then said, Gerard has known that for years. That was better than tears and worse than denial. How much? Not the full legal shape, but the practical one. He knew the estate rested on arrangements. No one wanted examined too closely. Graham kept telling him there would eventually have to be a cleaning of title. Gerard always answered that old families survive by leaving old rooms closed. That was exact enough to keep. And Hollis Crewe? He frightened him, she said. Not because Hollis was cleverer, because Hollis was vulgar enough to use daylight as a threat. That matched the whole case too well to improve. From Clara, I went to Gerard, who this time did not waste energy pretending to dislike me more than circumstances required. He was in the billiard room again, where the dead and the living had now both spent too much time, and his face had gone from anger into something more useful. Strain, I told him what I knew, the missing papers, the old claim, the false continuity, the fact that the North parcels had never legally belonged to the estate, in the neat, straight way the family had lived by. He let me finish. Then he said, You think that means everything is theft? Number, I think it means everything is vulnerable. His mouth tightened. There is a difference. Yes, but not one a blackmailer or a court would honor. He turned away, and then back. Graham told me last year that if the old paper chain were ever assembled in one place, the whole thing might have to be settled publicly, and you preferred it unassembled. Of course. There we are. He breathed out through the nose. You make inherited catastrophe sound like appetite. No, I said. I make murder sound like administration. That landed. It was not confession, not yet, but it had the right kind of silence after it. When I got back to the brownstone in the evening, Wolf needed very little from me. That is how I know he is nearly ready. He only asked 3 questions. Did Clara confirm Gerard's knowledge? Yes. Did Gerard deny the practical danger? Numbered, did anyone yet behave as though concealment mattered more than grief? I thought of Gerard in the billiard room, of Graham Vale staying behind with papers that could undo his profession, of the room at auction passing a lot like a contagious relic. Yes, Wolf nodded. Good. Then tomorrow we conclude. Later, at my window, I looked down at the street and thought about value. People are sentimental about price because price can be written in figures and paid by fools. Value is harder. The papers in Lot 47 were old, dry, unframed, unsaleable on the surface, and not worth a collector's sneeze. But if read correctly, they tied a great house to land that had never legally belonged to it cleanly. And if that was proved, fortunes would collapse, reputations would fracture, and every old arrangement held together by discretion would begin to split at the seams. Graham Vale had understood that too late. The killer had not acted from impulse, not in the corridor over Marcus Pell, not later in the library over Graham, and certainly not in arranging the silence of the room before the lot ever came to public notice. He had acted from necessity as perceived by a man who believed that if the papers lived, too much else might die. And by then, the worthless lot had become exactly what the room had known it was from the start, the most valuable secret in it. Chapter 10. The price of what wasn't sold. The case was solved, as Wolf prefers them solved, in the office on West 35th Street, with chairs enough for discomfort, beer enough for patience, and one dead object still absent from the room. Lot 47 never came back. That was almost graceful of it. Some objects, after doing enough damage, ought to have the decency not to reappear covered in fingerprints and explanation. The missing box had begun the matter, yes, but by then the box itself was no longer essential. It had already done its real work. It had frightened a room, exposed a lawyer, and shown us which silences in New York are purchased, which are inherited, and which finally turn murderous when someone insists on reading aloud. Wolf had me arrange them for 7:30. Clara Ashford, Gerard Ashford, Pelham Voss, Lucas Dane, Ella Rowe, Inspector Kramer and Stebbins, Mrs. Eveline Fenwick too, because she had started the business, and because Wolf, in one of his rarer moods of justice, believed clients who pay ought occasionally to be allowed the luxury of hearing why. Fritz had put coffee on one table and beer on another. The yellow lamplight improved the room without flattering anybody in it. Outside, the city had settled into wet spring dark, with the taxis hissing on the avenue and the windows across the street, trying to look private and failing. Clara Ashford sat very straight and very pale in the red leather chair. Gerard had taken the chair nearest the bookcase, as if books might still suggest legitimacy by proximity. Lucas Dane looked as if he had come to appraise the evening and found it oversupplied in nerves. Pelham Voss carried his outrage like a gentleman's cane. Ella Rowe sat near the end table with her hands quiet in her lap and her eyes on Wolf, which was sensible because no one else in the room had earned such concentrated attention. Mrs. Fenwick had installed herself with the satisfaction of a woman whose anxiety had matured into vindication. Kramer stood because sitting in Wolf's office always gives him the look of a man trying to digest upholstery. When Wolf had let the silence season enough, he began. Lot 47, he said, was passed at auction because the room had been instructed not to want it. Mrs. Fenwick made a pleased little sound. Clara did not move. Gerard's jaw set harder. Wolf continued. Mr. Graham Vale had quietly warned selected bidders that the lot was family archival matter, commercially useless and best left untouched. His purpose was plain. If the box passed unsold, it could return to private custody without outside claim, receipt, or lawful curiosity. The room obeyed because enough of its occupants understood that a public bid would not be treated as commerce. It would be treated as declaration. Lucas Dane inclined his head 1 degree, which from him amounted to applause. Wolf looked toward him and then away. Mr. Dane confirmed this, Mr. Voss corroborated it. Clara Ashford knew it. Gerard Ashford relied on it. Thus the first silence in the case was not the blackout in the corridor or the disappearance of the box. It was the silence of restraint at the auction table. Kramer grunted. "All right, we know that." "No," Wolf said. "You know it as atmosphere. I know it as mechanism." "There is a difference." That shut him up, which always improves the room. Wolf picked up one sheet from his desk. It was one of Ella Rowe's copied abstracts, and though none of us could read it from where we sat, the paper itself had by then acquired enough gravity to qualify as a witness. "The contents of Lot 40. 7 were not marketable valuables," he said. "They were more dangerous. Old deeds, private letters, trust references, survey fragments, and index notes proving that the Ashford North properties were not separate accidents but a concealed chain. Certain parcels had been controlled, transferred, or used by the estate without ever being cleanly and publicly joined through lawful title. The papers did not create the danger, they made it provable." Clara closed her eyes briefly. Gerard did not. Wolf's voice remained level. "Hollis Crew discovered enough of this hidden structure to understand its leverage, he intended, through pressure, publicity, or bargain, to profit from it. Graham Vale understood too late that if the papers were read aloud in the proper company, the estate's visible confidence would fracture. That is why Marcus Pell died when the box became reachable, and why Graham Vale died after staying behind to comprehend what the papers truly threatened." Mrs. Fenwick said. "Then it was Gerard. It was exactly the sort of line clients deliver in detective stories, and exactly the sort Wolf dislikes." He turned his head and gave her a look fit for lesser vegetation. "Madam, impatience is not deduction." She flushed and sat back. I was grateful another sentence from her and Fritz might have had to intervene. Wolf went on. "Gerard Ashford had motive. Certainly, he depended most obviously on continuity of possession. He knew enough of the hidden structure to fear exposure, but he lacked one thing the murderer possessed in abundance." "Which is?" Kramer barked. "Control of sequence," Wolf said. "Gerard desired concealment. He did not orchestrate it. His instinct was to close drawers, not compose rooms." That was true. Gerard looked relieved for half a second, then remembered Wolf had not acquitted him of being obnoxious. Wolf shifted his attention to Clara Ashford. Clara Ashford knew the box mattered. She understood that bidding on it would start open war within the family. She knew before many others did that Lot 47 attached to a buried structure. But she did not possess the documents long enough, or the opportunities early enough, to arrange the first death. Her knowledge sharpened too late. Clara said nothing. She did not thank him, which was good sense. "Pelham Voss," Wolf said, with contempt so slight it was almost politeness. Number he valued commissions and order, not blood. Lucas Dane. Number he knew enough to look away, which is his profession, but not enough to kill over ownership questions unrelated to his own purse. Miss Rowe plainly. No. She first read the documents accurately, yes, but accuracy endangered her. It did not profit her. Ella Rowe stayed very still. I knew why. Wolf had just done something more valuable than exoneration. He had publicly credited competence. In that room, with those people, that counted, Kramer said. Then who the hell is left? Wolf's eyes moved to Pelham Voss, then to Gerard, then to Clara, and finally settled where I had known for 10 minutes they would settle. "The man who taught the room not to see the lot," he said. "The man who tried to keep it from sale, then stayed behind to read it, then died." No one spoke, even Kramer waited, Wolf said. Or rather, the man everyone believed stayed behind to read it. That changed the air. I had my notebook ready only because I knew Wolf would enjoy not needing it. "Graham Vale did not die because he discovered the truth too late," Wolf said. That was the false center of the case. It is what the murderer wished us to think, that he, like Marcus Pell, had become another victim of the paper's danger. But Graham Vale was not trying to understand the papers in the library. He already understood them. He had understood them for years. Gerard Ashford said, sharply. Of course he had. "Yes," Wolf said, "and because he understood them, he also understood what the auction silence required, whom to warn, how to direct the room away from Lot 47, and what would happen if the box returned quietly to private custody. He wanted it passed because he wanted it controlled. Kramer stepped forward. You saying Vale killed Pell and somebody else killed Vale?